Okay. As you want in English, je vais in English. As you okay. Well, it's a quick question. Thank you for your presentation the first moment. And I wanted you to kind of explain a little bit further how we need to narrate the relation of past to present differently. I mean, you explain, of course, like that this need to escape from emancipation, the thought of emancipation, and we need to reconfigure the past, the present, and the future. But how is it possible to escape from this historical consciousness of this kind of linear time and emancipation, maybe in a more like methodological or practical way? You know, I mean, you said that everything is around tragic and the tragedy, but how do we really kind of escape from emancipation? And is it possible to escape from this thought of emancipation? And related to this question is like, can you tell us what do you do with the thought of humanism? And can you also maybe tell us, like, yeah, what do you think about those new thoughts of going overpass, this new thought of like that look for overpassing humanism, like Afrocentrism or Afrofuturism. So yeah, I'd like to maybe get an insight in this particular aspect. I know it's kind of but it's just like, it's just because it's kind of really clear what you're saying about this, you know, cause-elect, future past, and how we need to remove from like this futurity of the past. But it's just like, and then it's hard to really kind of understand what is the alternative.
Right. Je ne sais pas si je peux répondre exactement, précisément, oui. Mais je pense que je peux dire quelque chose comme ça en anglais. One of the places that I begin was a kind of dissatisfaction with Foucault, a very particular dissatisfaction. There came a moment when I couldn't discern what present it was that Foucault's histories of the present were meant to be a description of. Because in Foucault's genealogies, the present is a very large structure, the structure of the modern in some form. And there comes a time when that is no longer, and Foucault has, of course, a very elaborate way of describing the internal configuration of the modern, in relation to which his story of the past connects in that discontinuous way to that present. And there comes a moment for me when that present is not adequate. It's not, I recognize it in some way, but it is not a precise enough or a small or a narrow enough present. And so the question for me becomes how, and it is a general question in some form, what is the present in relation to which the past is to be redescribed? That to me is a general question. And I think that there are many different kinds of presence in relation to which one can undertake the task of a redescription of the past. And I think that the present can be that kinds of presence that I want to think about, the present in the wake of political independence, for example, is not a present that can simply be described in the large categories of modernity. There are other questions, more specifically the question of the character, configuration, possibility, etc., of the idea of the nation, for example. The question of the place of the internal structuring of the idea of sovereignty, for example, that describe more precisely the present that I am interested in than the large categories of the modern. So it seems to me that to rethink the past, or to ask oneself what new questions about pastness ought to shape my relationship to alternative futurities, requires, first of all, redescribing the present in which new questions can emerge. What is the question that animates me, if you like, right? And partly that's a question for me about generations. So one of the things that Small Axe did for me personally is that in many of the earlier issues of Small Axe, I conducted very long interviews with Caribbean intellectuals of an older generation. And I didn't know what I was doing. I simply embarked on this, partly in the transition from Sri Lanka back to thinking about Jamaica. And what it began to emerge in those interviews was the way in which a certain anticipation of nation generated out of the dissatisfaction or the discontent with colonialism emerged for that older generation. I don't live through a discontent with colonialism. I have no notion, I have no experience of colonialism, right? And therefore, the question of my present was a dissatisfaction with the post-colonial. I grew up inside of a discontent with sovereignty. And that discontent with sovereignty is not shaped by a prior hope for what sovereignty could be, but was not. I don't have that experience. All of that earlier generation before me, James, Stuart, all of those people, know an immediacy of discontent with the colonial in relation to which their hope of a future possibility was shaped. So one of the large questions, as I said earlier, that define the present for me in various kinds of configurations. Nation is a big word that holds different ways of thinking about or different ways of describing a present. In the Jamaican context, very specifically, I could say, for example, that part of the present is shaped by the malaise around the two-party parliamentary democracy that constitutes that present, and the kinds of debates that exist between these two political entities, and the inability, irrespective of the jargon of the relationship between past and futures that major politicians employ, that they are now sides of the same coin, at least for my generation. And that stasis or that stagnation of the political debate defines, from my generational perspective, the almost irrelevance of the two-party political system. I'm not putting this well. From a certain generational perspective, I think generations are really very important now. And one of the things that interests me as a matter of intellectual history is the different historical moments across the 20th and now early 20th century when generations as a category emerges as a way of thinking both with and against class as another kind of category of social analysis. I think we live in a moment when generations offers a really suggestive point of departure that differentiates that reorients the kind of analysis that one can engage in. From a different generational perspective, people older than me, who grew up in Jamaica, for example, still believe and are still animated by the two-party political system and think that we can have different kinds of policies, and those policies can reanimate the nation. I think that that's a dead end. I think that not that I won't vote, or whatever, right, or march, but I think that that they're asking that the error there is that they don't recognize, an older generation in some ways, that the problem space has shifted, such that it's still possible and one can still recognize the old structure of questions, but that old structure of questions won't break the paradigm in which we live. And the question for us, I think, is how to break that paradigm. And to break the paradigm, I think, requires redescribing the present in relation to which we ask questions about the past. Does that?
First part, yes, very question.
Oh, there's another question. What?
But maybe we should, and then I can ask later the second part of the question.
I don't remember it.
Quelqu'un veut intervenir, poser une question? Harry?
About the description of the present, could you tell us what is your relationship with the anthropological method? Because you talked about it in the beginning. And what do you
I shouldn't have laughed.
No, it's fine. And maybe to be more precise, what do you think about, what's his name, Spiro's critique of postmodernism?
Oh, I don't know whether Spiro. Which Spiro? Melford?
Melford, yeah.
Oh my, is he still alive?
No, that's here a couple of years ago.
That,
But he's alive in the present.
yes, apparently. No, that's good. I know he interested me a lot because of his earlier work. I don't know what his criticism specifically of the postmodern is. I have a difficult relationship, a contentious relationship to anthropology. I have a contentious relationship to method. Do you remember Fanon's wonderful remark about method in the preface to Peignoir Masque Blanc? I can't remember exactly. But there's a moment when method is reintegrated. Mathieu, quickly. To the mathematicians and the botanists. So anyway, so I'm not sure what one means by anthropological method. My general worry about method is a worry about the freezing of particular strategies of intervention. And when strategies of intervention freeze in such a way that one is simply, with a kind of automaticity, putting them back into operation. You know, Ian Hacking, I don't know if people here read Ian Hacking. He was at the Collège de France. I don't know if he's still there. In Foucault's chair, was it Foucault's chair that he had? I can't remember. But he had a wonderful remark about Foucault that I think is absolutely apropos to this question of method. He said that Foucault carved brilliant ice sculptures. And having sculpted these pieces of art out of ice, he insouciantly walked away from them so that they began to melt. And the epigony ran to those structures and put them in the freezer so that they could take them out periodically and put Foucault's genealogical method to work. I think that's a brilliant, he captures brilliantly something about what we should fear about methods. One could say the same thing about Stuart Hall and cultural studies, that he produces a kind of intervention that is conjuncturally constructed. And then insouciantly, he resigns from the Open University and goes about his business. And then cultural studies is reified into a discipline. So I have, I think, an instinctive terror of that moment of the conversion of intervention into something called a method. And I have a double fear, I think, of large disciplinary structures that seek to impose, like anthropology or like philosophy or like history or like whatever these disciplines that colonize us are, that want to inscribe in teaching us a method a kind of dogmatic truth about, or a kind of dogma about how to get at the truth of the world. So ethnography is in some way one of the dogmas of anthropological method. And I think that's what it is, a kind of dogma. When I did these long interviews, I'm giving you a very roundabout and inadequate response. When I did these long interviews, I called them field work, because in some way I thought of myself as being in a discussion about a moral elsewhere that I both was connected to but disconnected from. These were people that I both had a sense of but was alien to. And there was a kind of living dialogue through which a relationship was constructed. And therefore there was a kind of, a kind of ethnographic realism that shaped my relationship to the worlds of the people that I was interested in. But I think of that as a kind of experiment that I wouldn't seek to inscribe in a kind of disciplinary reproduction of a scholarly self. So that's
Le fétichisme du terrain.
Yes.
Le fétichisme
Yes.
du terrain.
Exactly.
Oui, mais c'est peut-être pour ça que... could I speak in French? Yes.
Why not?
Uh,
Not that I will understand, but yeah.
I feel like it is
Yeah.
in French.
Yes.
C'est peut-être pour ça que tu as un petit peu dévié cette lourdeur disciplinaire. C'est un peu, comment dirais-je, n'est-ce pas une facilité quand même d'avoir glissé un peu vers la philosophie pour éviter, c'est pas un évitement de la recherche de...
Je ne comprends pas exactement.
The fact to go further in philosophy, is it a way of avoiding what could be because what I have an idea.
Oui. En français, c'est possible.
I have noticed that you don't want to do what is verification, what we could call verification of facts and so on. But yeah, I read you anytime with a connection between what you observe and what you think about what you observe, but you don't want, it's my way of reading your papers and your text, that you are doing, what you are doing is a search for, without saying it, a search for adequation. For example, in the famous text that I like a lot, when you say that the black subject is always made inside, I don't remember exactly the word, inside the structure of subjectivation, which create the subject as a black subject. It's an observation. It's a way of observing the reality, the social reality.
Oui.
What you can do with that? Because it's adéquation.
Oui, mais adéquation n'est pas la même chose de la vérification.
Oui, je suis d'accord. C'est ce que je dis.
Oui. But, and this goes back to the question here, I think, of anthropological method. The question about verification emerges specifically in relation to Richard Price's work,
Yes.
right? And which I don't.
Maybe we will go to the second moment with that.
Yeah,
Yes,
but we are in the
can
second
finish
moment,
it.
right?
Yes,
Are we?
the second moment is about Price and
Oh, is it?
Herskovits. No, I'm joking. But
Because the question of the New World black subject emerges very specifically in the so-called anthropology of the New World Negro in the early part of the 20th century. And how to think about the authenticity of that New World black subject. What is that subject? Who is that subject? What is his authenticity? What is her culture, her history, his memory? I mean, those are questions that emerge enormously important, of course, in a variety of spaces across the New World. But in relation to anthropology, it's the question that Herskovits seeks to answer inside of a very particular anthropological method in which he is the theory of acculturation, right? And the theory of attempting to discern the degree to which newer scale of retentions by which he sought to measure the exact proximity of different blacks to the authentic source, namely Africa. Now, I personally think that's rubbish, but I think what is important is to try to understand the kind of problem that animates that question. What is it? What is the New World black subject thought to be in a hegemonic discourse that propels that direction of thinking? So Herskovits, as a humanist, is trying profoundly, mistakenly, I think, but nevertheless profoundly, to offer a critique of racism by demonstrating that New World blacks have, to varying degrees, a real culture that can be related to the authentic source of black culture, namely Africa. So that's a verificationist structure. And that verificationist structure is obviously a kind of epistemological structure that lies at the core of the founding moment of the anthropology of black folk in the New World. It animates that famous essay by Richard Price and Sidney Mintz of 1970, whenever it is, and it shapes that really profound intervention that Richard Price makes in First Time, right? Which is where that essay comes from. Now, Richard, at the epigraph of Richard Price's book is fascinating. Richard Price says that somebody says, I can't remember whether this is his or somebody says something like this, that there comes a day in time, if you remember, there comes a day in time when the last eyes to see Christ closed forever. That is a magnificent opening, right? There comes a day, so for Richard Price, there comes a day in time when the last eyes to see an African close forever. Henceforth, the question is about memory. So, I think that's a fascinating beginning. And so Richard Price's preoccupation is not to count the traits, as Herskovits was doing, but to measure historical consciousness. And he does so, by those of you who don't know the work, by showing that the memory of the Saramaka can be set alongside the colonial archive, and it can be demonstrated that the Saramaka have a correct memory of the past. But what Price does not do is to produce an ideological critique of the colonial archive, the colonial archive is presumed to be a standard in relation to which the memory of the Saramaka can be measured. So,
But doesn't he need a method to do that?
yes, he does. But what is that method? Right? He doesn't produce that method.
It's very strange. I think that, je vais le dire en français. Là, du coup, le problem space, il marche très bien parce que Price, aujourd'hui, n'écrirait absolument pas comme ça. Non, il ne le ferait pas. Le discours hégémonique du monde académique lui interdirait. Peut-être qu'on peut préciser, c'est le livre de First Time. C'est le livre First Time qui a fait connaître Price quand même, qui a été un de ses livres les plus fameux quand même.
Oui, I think so, yeah, First Time, yeah.
Premier temps, et qui alors moi je suis beaucoup plus choquée par autre chose en premier temps. Je suis très choquée parce que c'est la collecte du récit des initiés à l'histoire Saramaka, donc les Saramaka, les Marrons du Suriname. Donc il a collecté, et sa méthode d'exposition du récit des Saramaka se déploie sur des pages divisées en deux, où il y a le récit des Saramaka en haut et ce qu'il va trouver aux archives en bas. Et il valide, d'où l'épistémologie, moi j'adore cette notion, l'épistémologie de la vérification, qu'il va donc voir si, c'est complètement curieux comme méthode, c'est très, mais elle est datée, elle est des années 80. Je pense qu'il David Scott a critiqué, je pense que c'est l'une des critiques les plus vives. Michel Ralph-Trouillot aussi avait critiqué vivement Richard Price, qui semble être dans un monde incritique. Il est hors de la critique. Donc, je pense que c'est important de préciser en quoi David Scott a analyser ce texte comme étant celui d'une épistémologie de la vérification qui est préoccupée par savoir si les Saramaka disent leur récit est vrai ou pas par rapport aux archives. Ce qui aujourd'hui, d'après moi, ne serait absolument plus. Et il a été touché. Price ne fait que dire je fais pas de l'épistémologie de la vérification. Il a reçu ce texte comme violent. Et moi, ce que je trouve le plus critiquable dans le texte First Time, et je tiens à le dire, c'est plutôt que le récit qu'il tient, c'est un problème éthique et non méthodologique. C'est que le récit de ces fameux Saramaka tient son pouvoir d'être tenu secret. Or, il a été publié en anglais, il a été traduit en français, il a été traduit en néerlandais, il n'a pas été traduit en Saramaka d'ailleurs. Il vient d'être traduit en Saramaka avec l'argent que Price a eu du procès dans lequel il est intervenu pour défendre les Saramaka, pour protéger leurs terres. Et là, il a... Voilà. Pour ça, moi, sur le plan éthique, c'est beaucoup plus grave que sur le plan...
But, you know, I mean, there are two things that, Christine, one is that, absolutely, the book was published in 1983, and it is part of, to go back to this question about anthropological method, it was seen as one of the great experiments in postmodern anthropology, one of the exemplary texts of that particular moment of the so-called postmodern turn, or the linguistic turn in American cultural anthropology in the 1980s. And undoubtedly. But the second question, to me more important, is that I mean, you know, whether or not Price has a method to interrogate that colonial archive, for me, is less crucial than his assumption that the narrative of the Saramaka requires verification. Why do these people's understanding of their past require, in the first place, to be shown to be correct? That is an assumption that lies at the heart of the problematic of the anthropology of New World people of African descent. That they somehow are constituted by knowledges that require a kind of another archive in relation to which their own stories about themselves should be adjudicated. And I think that that's a misunderstanding. And so, so it's a hedge that's a really interesting. One sees this in. So the essay that came after that, which was the essay of mine that I wrote after that event, This Memory, which was the essay on Brathwaite. You mentioned it earlier. I can't remember the title. Which is an essay on Kamal Brathwaite, one of the great poets of the. In many ways, an oeuvre which is very, very similar to Edouard Glissant. Very similar. They're the kinds of convergences and divergences that connect and disconnect them. A literary historian and poet for whom who at a certain moment believes that his literary construction of his own historical self-consciousness needs to depend on the authority of anthropology. And I think that is a mistaken way of thinking about authority and discipline, and most importantly, a mistaken way of thinking about the idea of the kind of truth of one's cultural past that is required in order to authenticate one's literary discourse. I think that there's a real internal. That there's a. I want to call it a category mistake, but I'm reluctant to do so because I don't want to be myself to be trapped inside of an epistemological problematic. And that's partly my worry about these kinds of disciplines, that they present us with an epistemological authority that subject peoples are required to acquire in order to legitimize their own discourse. And I reject that view. Politically and morally, reject that view. Even though I inhabit a department of anthropology, but I inhabit it strategically. Because it pays me a salary. But I think I don't. That's not entirely true. Obviously, I don't mean to be facetious exactly, but that I think it's important to wear discipline lightly. I think, at least in the U.S. context, I don't know about the French academic context, anthropology is a capacious house to inhabit, a large house, a spacious house to inhabit. There is nothing that one can't think. There is no discipline that one is that is interdicted, that one is prevented from mobilizing. And that's the character of the space, of the disciplinary space of anthropology. It's not the case in history departments in the US, and it's not the case in sociology departments, and it's not the case in literary departments. But it is the case in anthropology that there is space, or else no one would have me in that house. En français, pas grave.
Okay. Est-ce que la volonté d'être discipliné, je pense que c'est à peu près la même chose, n'est pas, j'ai l'impression de faire les bonnes erreurs. Les bonnes erreurs. Les erreurs qu'on peut faire entre nous, sans avoir la vérité.
I don't know whether that's what I'm saying exactly. I don't dismiss discipline. I don't. I think that one has to have a cautious relationship to discipline, whatever the discipline may be, whether it's philosophy or anthropology or any of these. I think that one has to have a cautious, strategic relationship to discipline. That's the way that I would respond to that.
Sarah, tu voulais
talked about revolutions and generations, and I wondered, when you belong to a generation, somehow you rephrase and conceptualize or rethink the past, the future, and the present. And I felt like, or maybe it's wrong understanding, but it's some kind of inevitable cycle that we go through, even if we don't want. Meaning that your generation was different from the previous one, and the previous one wanted to make some kind of revolution to counter the previous one as well. So, is there some kind of cycle in this? And how do we actually articulate some kind of overlapping temporality in this? I'm not sure I'm clear.
No, you're very clear. But do you remember Fanon comes to mind here, that wonderful remark in, I don't remember what chapter, on nationalism in Les Damnés de la Terre, that each generation...
Remarque de Fanon sur le nationalisme de la Terre.
Each generation produces its own set of problems that it has to then overcome. I think that's... So, I don't want to be heard as... although I'm often heard this way, as suggesting any kind of inevitability in any form or fashion. But it is true that partly as a worry about the kind of discontinuities that post-structuralism, I don't know what the preferred term is here, what that term, the fetishization of discontinuity or of rupture that is produced in those kinds of strategies, I want to worry a little bit about. And I want to ask again, from this side of that rupture, if you like, whether there aren't forms of continuity that aren't important to think and think with. And therefore, for me, the question, for example, about the question of the idea of a tradition is enormously important to think with, and the relationship between generation and tradition, as partly a way of thinking about what it is, I hear those sighs, what it is about how we think that is connected to kinds of pasts that we can't simply, by an act of reason, by a voluntary act of criticism, separate ourselves from. That there is a sense in which we find ourselves inside of certain kinds of debates, certain kinds of discourses that shape already the perspective from which we want to engage critically. So, in some form, people, I don't know how to put this, I find myself, speaking about me in particular, to simultaneously recognize the nationalist, to recognize the space from which black nationalism emerges, say, in the Caribbean that I know, and people who were my teachers who were black nationalists or are, and to think about the location of that black nationalism in a certain kind of structure of white supremacy, whether in the context of the neocolonial state or in the context of the 1960s and early 1970s US white supremacist state. And to think that that black nationalism is not exactly the same as 1990s Afrocentrism. That these emerge in different kinds of problem spaces, and even as they activate a certain kind of privileged figure of black authenticity, they do so against and in the context of different backgrounds. The issue for me is, again, how to understand the question that propels that particular configuration of black nationalist discourse, or of any discourse for that matter. So, and I think that the generational space from which one thinks that or understands it changes depending on the debates out of which one emerges. So I mean, there is no physiological, certainly no organic continuity. Generation is something that is itself a social construction. The events that orient a particular... There is a generation, for example, that emerges around, in France, obviously, in part, around 1968. 1968 as a catalytic moment for the emergence of a generational sensibility. But that depends on how one remembers and tells the story of 1968 as catalytic for a particular age group, vaguely. And similarly, in the Caribbean, there is a moment of Walter Rodney in 1968 that is perceived retrospectively to be catalytic in shaping a generational perspective. I am not part of that generation. I have no sense of 1968. But 1974 and the emergence of the socialist project in Jamaica is catalytic for my own sense of the futurity as well as the pastness of my generation.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions dans la salle?
Moi, je voudrais faire quelques remarques, questions. On en a parlé un peu dans le break, donc ça va être court. En tant qu'historien, mais bon, on est plusieurs historiens, c'est la question en fait du futur antérieur. Nous ne devrions-nous pas parler de futur antérieur, parce que il y a quelques années ici, on avait fait un colloque sur les indépendances africaines, comment elles avaient été vécues, comment elles étaient remémorées. Et nos collègues qui traitaient de différents pays africains montraient bien en fait qu'il y avait différents agents producteurs de projets dans la phase de décolonisation. Et bien évidemment, d'un point de vue hégémonique, il y a des hégémonies disciplinaires, mais il y a tout simplement les hégémonies des souverainetés qui écrivent l'histoire. Avoir le pouvoir, c'est écrire l'histoire ou la réécrire. Donc qui annihilent, qui annulent cette pluralité. Donc ne devrions-nous pas être sensibles au fait que à différents moments, en particulier des moments d'espoir possible, il y a des futurs, alors, de notre point de vue, donc des futurs antérieurs. Et ça rejoindrait une interrogation que j'avais aussi, c'était le fait que les intellectuels sont un peu dans cette dead end, dans cette voie sans issue dont vous parliez. Est-ce que en tant que...
Dead end, c'est un mot français.
Oui, ça y est, j'ai compris.
Est-ce que, au-delà des disciplines, on peut être effectivement dans une discipline ou un peu indiscipliné, mais alors là c'est plutôt la question de l'intellectuel, effectivement, ne devrions-nous pas également dire aux nouvelles générations, dans le passé, il y a eu plein de projets, ça ouvre à des possibles, et ça peut éventuellement permettre d'aller au-delà de ce monde un peu chaotique dans lequel nous sommes, pour ouvrir justement les possibles ou appuyer chez des jeunes générations une inventivité du futur. Donc ça c'était un peu disons une question d'historien, mais également pas seulement d'historien, de citoyen.
I think that part of the way that I would respond to that is, to begin with, as we were talking earlier, I share the view that we live a post-colonial as though the story of as though the sovereignty story of the making of the nation state as we know it today was the only story inscribed in the anti-colonial project, as though that was as though the present of that past is looking back at that past forward, the only kind of future that could have been imagined. However, it is the case that that anti-colonialists, whoever they were, wherever they were, inherited a story about political maturation which was shaped by the modern story of sovereignty. And so, in some way, although that story of sovereignty was a hegemonic one, it is not surprising that that is the path along which they directed the anti-colonial movements that they directed, and they themselves suppressed other kinds of anti-colonial possibilities, whether regional or reimaginings of the possibility of what statehood could be, and so forth. And there are intimations that there were different conceptions of the relationship of the idea of the state to begin with in some anti-colonial movements. So I think that there is a task of rewriting the story, or certainly re-examining the story of re-examining what I want to call the autobiography of anti-colonialism. That there is a hegemonic story of anti-colonialism that is worth re-examining in order to discern what other possibilities there might have been, and to take up the question, a kind of what-if question in some way. What if those movements were more robust and had been able to gain political traction? What kind of present might they have emerged? I think that those are important thought experiments, but those thought experiments have, I think, to be enacted in a context in which one recognizes the hegemony of the story of sovereignty which we have inherited.